The first time I saw her, I was calibrating the soil density scanner outside the Nomad. A flash of movement at the edge of my vision made me look up, scanning the jagged ridgeline that dominated the eastern horizon of XC7. There she stood, motionless against the bruise-colored sky, a silhouette with an unmistakably humanoid posture, but something decidedly non-human in its proportions. I blamed fatigue initially. 6 days alone on this barren rock would make anyone see things. But when I raised my hand to shield my eyes from the glare of the setting binary stars, the figure remained, watching me with unwavering attention from atop a distant outcropping of frost-rimed stone. "Hello," I called, my voice swallowed immediately by the constant keening wind that swept across the plateau. The figure didn't move or respond, just watched. I ducked back into my ship, cycling through the external camera feeds, but the resolution wasn't high enough to capture clear details at that distance. Just a humanoid form, slightly too tall and lean to be human, seemingly wrapped in pale fur or a thick coat. Perhaps some previously undocumented indigenous species? The preliminary surveys had mentioned simple flora and some small burrowing fauna, but nothing sapient or even approaching human size. I reminded myself this was exactly why independent surveyors like me were sent to places like XC7. Preliminary scans miss things, especially on mineral-rich worlds where certain ore deposits can interfere with sensor readings. Universal Materials Incorporated didn't send me here to catalog wildlife, though. They wanted a detailed geological survey and samples of the crystalline formations detected from orbit. The ones that preliminary scans suggested might contain unprecedented concentrations of rare elements vital for quantum processing circuits. When I ventured outside again an hour later, the figure was gone. My unease faded as I recalibrated my equipment and set up the automated drilling rig that would take core samples overnight. But the next day, as I ascended a narrow ravine with my portable spectrometer, I saw her again. Closer this time, perched on a boulder halfway up the opposite slope. In the harsh midday light, I could make out more details. Definitely humanoid, but with a feline cast to her features, a delicate muzzle, high cheekbones covered in silver-white fur that caught the light with an almost crystalline sheen. Her proportions were wrong for a human. Too graceful, limbs slightly too long, digitigrade legs ending in what looked like padded feet rather than anything resembling boots. Her eyes were what held me frozen, large, lambent amber orbs that reflected the light like a predator's. She wore what seemed to be simple garments of leather or woven fiber that left her arms and lower legs bare, displaying more of that silver-white fur. I raised my hand slowly, palm outward in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent. She didn't respond, didn't mirror the gesture, just continued that unnerving, unblinking stare. "I'm not here to harm anything," I said, feeling foolish for talking to a creature that likely couldn't understand a word. "Just taking some rock samples." After several uncomfortable minutes of this standoff, I decided to continue my work, turning my back to her with some trepidation. When I glanced back 10 minutes later, she had vanished as silently as she'd appeared. That night, I ran a comprehensive diagnostic on the Nomad security systems and doubled the sensitivity on the proximity alarms. The winds howled outside, occasional ice crystals pinging against the hull. I found myself repeatedly checking the external cameras, half expecting to see that silent figure standing at the edge of the landing site, those amber eyes reflecting the running lights of my ship. But there was nothing but darkness and the occasional drift of something like snow across the field of view. I entered the day's findings into my log, noting the unusual encounter, though I kept the entry professional and detached. No point in having UMI question my mental state. 6 more weeks on this contract, alone on this desolate world. The isolation could play tricks on anyone's mind. On the 3rd day, I spotted her again while deploying seismic sensors along a promising geological fault line. This time she stood barely 50 meters away, making no attempt to hide behind the twisted crystal formations that jutted from the ground like the spines of some enormous buried creature. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," I said loudly, surprising myself with the sound of my own voice after days of near silence. She tilted her head slightly, the first change in demeanor I'd witnessed. Her ears, yes, definitely feline in shape, swiveled forward as if to better catch my words. I clear my throat, suddenly self-conscious. Do you understand me? No response, but her posture shifted subtly. Was she leaning forward? Curious? I waved my arms and shouted, partly out of frustration, partly to see if I could provoke any reaction. This is getting old. What do you want? She retreated several graceful steps, but didn't flee. Instead, she settled into a crouching position on a flat stone, wrapping her tail. I could now clearly see a long, sinuous tail around her feet. She continued watching me with that same penetrating gaze. Unnerved, but determined to complete my day's work, I finished setting the sensors, keeping her in my peripheral vision. She remained motionless, tracking my movements with small turns of her head, those eyes never leaving me. I returned to the Nomad as the light began to fade, leaving her still perched on her stone. The ship's external sensors registered nothing unusual overnight. No approach to the vessel, no tampering attempts. Just the endless wind and periodic minor tremors from the planet's unstable crust. On the fourth day, I decided to remain inside and analyze the previous day's seismic readings. The data showed promising densities that might indicate the presence of the mineral formations UMI was hunting for. I deliberately avoided checking the external cameras until midday, at which point curiosity got the better of me. She was there, of course, standing perhaps 20 meters from the Nomad, perfectly still except for the slow swish of her tail and the occasional twitch of her ears. Just watching. The high-resolution view from the main camera confirmed my impressions. Definitely a feline-human hybrid, though whether naturally evolved or the product of some ancient genetic engineering, I couldn't begin to guess. Her features held an undeniable intelligence, a presence behind those amber eyes that went beyond animal curiosity. I shut off the feed and tried to focus on my work, but the knowledge of her silent vigil outside my ship made concentration impossible. Finally, with a muttered curse, I donned my environmental suit and cycled through the airlock. The planet's thin atmosphere was technically breathable but bitterly cold and lacking enough oxygen for sustained activity. The suit's respirator supplemented what was missing while maintaining my body temperature against the perpetual chill. She hadn't moved when I emerged, though her ears flicked forward with obvious interest. I approached slowly until about 10 meters separated us. "I'm Kale," I said, tapping my chest. Kale Soren, geological surveyor. I felt ridiculous, like a character in one of those old First Contact films, but I had to try something. She made no move to respond, just continued that unwavering stare that somehow seemed to look through me rather than at me. "All right then," I said after an awkward silence. "I'm going back to work. Feel free to keep doing whatever this is." I turned away, frustrated, and began checking the external instrument arrays attached to the Nomad's hull. It was nearly dusk when I completed my maintenance rounds. As I approached the airlock, I noticed something on the ground beside the entry ramp, something that definitely hadn't been there before. A crystal, roughly the size of my palm, lay carefully centered on a flat piece of dark stone. The crystal was unlike any of the mineral samples I collected so far, clear as water, but with a core that seemed to pulse with a faint bluish luminescence. I glanced around, but my visitor had disappeared. I scanned the crystal with my handheld analyzer before touching it. No radiation, no toxic compounds, just an unusual crystalline structure with trace elements my device couldn't readily identify. I picked it up carefully. It was warm to the touch despite the frigid air, and the inner light seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. An optical illusion, surely. Back inside the Nomad, I placed the strange gift on my workbench and stared at it for a long time. Why would she give me this? What did it mean? Was it a warning? A peace offering? Or simply an object of curiosity she thought might interest me? After much deliberation, I decided to respond in kind. The next morning, I placed a small package wrapped in foil thermal blanket material outside the ship. Inside was a protein bar and a simple multi-tool for my supplies. Nothing valuable or potentially dangerous, but a reciprocal offering seemed appropriate. When I checked a few hours later, my package was gone. In its place lay a small bundle of what appeared to be dried plants with a spicy, not unpleasant aroma. Beside this was a smooth stone that, when held up to light, revealed complex patterns of embedded fossils, tiny spiral shells, and what might have once been delicate fronds. And so began our strange, wordless exchange. Each day, I would leave something new, a small light that changed colors when squeezed, a sample of different earth foods from my stores, a piece of woven carbon fiber from a damaged component I'd replaced. Each day, these would be replaced with items that provided glimpses into XC7, unusual stones, dried plants with medicinal or aromatic properties, once even a kind of clay that hardened into a ceramic-like substance when exposed to air. She continued to appear daily, sometimes watching from a distance, sometimes approaching close enough that I could hear the soft pad of her feet on the rocky ground. I began speaking to her whenever she was present, narrating my work, explaining Earth customs, telling stories from my travels, anything to fill the silence, and perhaps build some bridge of understanding. I noted subtle changes in her behavior. She began to mimic some of my gestures, a tilt of the head, a wave of acknowledgement. Once when I pointed to myself and repeated, "Kale," she placed a clawed hand on her chest and made a soft trilling sound that might have been Lyra or something similar. I chose to call her Lyra, and she seemed to accept this, her ears perking forward whenever I used the name. On the 15th day of my survey mission, I was working some distance from the Nomad, collecting samples from a promising ridge, when Lyra appeared with unusual agitation in her movements. She approached closer than ever before, making sharp, insistent sounds at her throat and glancing repeatedly at the sky to the north. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual in the heavy cloud cover. She became more insistent, actually reaching toward me, the first time she'd initiated any contact, before pulling back her hand and pointing emphatically northward again. "What is it?" I asked. "I don't understand." She made a low, growling sound, clearly frustrated by our communication barrier. Then she crouched, scooped up some loose stones, and arranged them in a rough circle. With her clawed finger, she drew lines emanating outward from the circle, then made a swooping motion with her hand, ending with a sharp downward thrust. "Something's falling? Coming down," I guessed. Lyra nodded vigorously, another human gesture she'd adopted, and pointed again to the north, then to my instruments, then made a swift cutting motion across her throat. The meaning suddenly became clear. A storm? Some kind of atmospheric disturbance that could damage my equipment. She nodded again, this time grabbing my sleeve and tugging me toward a narrow crevice in the nearby cliff face. I hesitated only briefly before gathering my most essential instruments. If she was right, the Nomad's exterior equipment could be damaged, but the ship itself was designed to withstand extreme planetary conditions. I, however, was over 2 kilometers from safety with only my environmental suit for protection. We had barely reached the shelter of the deep, narrow crevice when the storm hit. Not rain or snow, but a deluge of crystalline particles driven by hurricane-force winds, like being caught in a sandblaster loaded with crushed glass. The particles rattled against my suit with enough force to register as impacts on the suit's integrity monitors. Without the protection of both the crevice and Lyra's warning, I would have been shredded. The storm raged for nearly an hour. In the confined space, Lyra and I sat facing each other, closer than we'd ever been. In the dim light filtering through the crystal haze outside, I could see the fine details of her features, the subtle patterns in her silver fur, the slight overbite of her canines against her lower lip, the intelligence, and what I could only describe as concern in those amber eyes. "Thank you," I said simply when the storm finally began to subside. She made a soft, chewing sound in response and reached out tentatively, touching the sleeve of my environmental suit where several deep scratches now marred the formerly smooth surface. Her expression needed no translation. You would have been hurt. As we emerged from our shelter, I surveyed the damage to the landscape. The crystal storm had scoured exposed surfaces, leaving fresh facets glittering on the stone formations around us. My equipment would need serious recalibration, and I wondered what condition I would find the Nomad in. Lyra accompanied me back to the ship, no longer maintaining her usual distance. She moved with easy grace across terrain that had me constantly checking my footing, occasionally pausing to wait when I fell behind. At one point, she deftly caught my arm when I stumbled on a section of newly crystallized ground, her strength surprising as she steadied me with minimal effort. The Nomad had weathered the storm well, its ablative outer hull designed for exactly these sorts of hostile conditions, though the external sensor arrays would need repairs. As I entered the airlock, I turned to thank Lyra again, only to find her already retreating, melting into the landscape with that uncanny silence. The next morning, she was waiting when I emerged from the Nomad, standing closer than ever before. When I approached, she made a beckoning gesture and began walking away, periodically looking back to ensure I was following. I hesitated, checking my handheld scanner. My survey area for the day lay in the opposite direction, but curiosity won out. I secured the Nomad, gathered my basic field kit and a supplemental oxygen supply, and followed. Our journey took most of the morning. Lyra led me along hidden paths through the seemingly barren landscape, through narrow defile, and across hidden plateaus. We descended gradually from the high, exposed region where I'd landed into a network of sheltered valleys. The atmosphere grew incrementally warmer and richer in oxygen as we moved deeper into the maze-like terrain. Finally, we approached what appeared to be a solid wall of crystalline rock. Lyra moved confidently to a narrow seam and slipped sideways through it. I followed with more difficulty, the passage barely wide enough for my shoulders and the environmental suit. The sight beyond stole my breath more effectively than the thin atmosphere ever could. We stood at the edge of a hidden valley, sheltered on all sides by towering crystal walls that refracted the sunlight into countless rainbow patterns. Unlike the barren highlands, this protected pocket teemed with life. Not Earth-like greenery, but something equally vibrant. Forests of crystal trees that hummed faintly in the breeze, beds of what appeared to be moss, but shimmered with metallic hues, pools of steaming water surrounded by formations that might have been coral or fungus, pulsing with bioluminescence. Lyra watched my reaction with evident satisfaction, a rumbling purr emanating from her chest. She gestured expansively, then tapped her chest. Home. As we ventured deeper into this hidden ecosystem, I understood why she had brought me here. This wasn't merely a display of natural beauty. It was a revelation. The crystalline formations I've been sent to survey, the ones that registered as rich mineral deposits from orbit, weren't just inert rocks. They were part of a complex, interconnected living system. Near the center of the valley, Lyra led me to a cave mouth emanating warmth and soft, rhythmic light. Inside, the walls were covered with pictographs, stylized figures that told a story I could only partially interpret. They showed beings like Lyra living in harmony with the crystal formations, but also depicted conflict, what appeared to be mining operations and the devastation that followed, a sickening of the land and its inhabitants. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the planet's temperature. My company, I said slowly, pointing one of the mining images. They want the crystals. They sent me to find them. Lyra nodded gravely, tracing her clawed finger along a sequence showing the crystal trees withering and her people suffering. These crystals, they're alive? Part of a life cycle? I asked. She made a complex gesture, hands weaving an intricate pattern that suggested interconnection, symbiosis. Then she led me to a small alcove where a cluster of crystals grew from the living rock, pulsing with the same blue luminescence as the one she'd given me. She placed her hand against them, and the pulsing accelerated, synchronizing with what I presumed was her heartbeat. When she removed her hand, they gradually returned to their slower rhythm. I understood then, or began to. The crystalline structures weren't merely aesthetic or coincidentally valuable for technology. They were keystone components in XE7's ecosystem. perhaps even serving as communication networks between the valley's life forms. Removing them would devastate this hidden world. My handheld scanner confirmed what I suspected. These were indeed the formations UMI had sent me to locate, rare Earth elements arranged in unprecedented natural lattices that would revolutionize quantum computing if harvested, worth billions in Earth markets, a significant percentage of which would go to me as the surveyor who located them. As we made our way back toward the valley entrance, movement caught my eye, another figure like Lyra, watching us warily from a crystalline outcropping, then another, partially hidden among what passed for vegetation. I realized we were being observed by perhaps a dozen of her kind, their silver-white fur making them nearly invisible against the glittering backdrop until they moved. "Your family? Your people?" I asked, gesturing toward the hidden watchers. Lyra made a sound that might have been affirmation. She led me back through the narrow passage to the highlands, the transition from that vibrant hidden ecosystem to the stark, seemingly lifeless landscape above as jarring as stepping from a greenhouse into a freezer. As we approached the Nomad, Lyra's posture changed. She pointed to my ship, then to the sky, then made a sharp, negative gesture. Her meaning was clear: don't bring others here. Don't reveal what you've seen. "I need to think," I told her, tapping my temple. "This complicates things." She nodded as if she understood perfectly, then melted away into the landscape, as was her custom, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of an ethical dilemma I hadn't anticipated when accepting this contract. That night, my sleep was troubled by dreams of crystalline forests screaming as they were uprooted, of amber eyes watching me with betrayal as mining ships descended from the clouds. I woke to the sound of my long-range scanner pinging an alert. An unscheduled vessel had entered XE7's upper atmosphere and was on a descent trajectory approximately 200 kilometers north of my position. The ship's profile didn't match any UMI vessels in my database. Unauthorized prospectors, claim jumpers, hoping to get a head start on whatever I might discover. Either way, their presence changed the equation significantly. If they found what I had seen, they wouldn't hesitate to strip mine the entire region, Hidden Valley and all. I was still processing this new development when movement on the external camera feeds caught my attention. Lyra was approaching the Nomad with uncharacteristic haste, and she wasn't alone. 3 other beast people accompanied her, all displaying the same feline characteristics, but with variations in fur pattern and coloration. I rushed to cycle the airlock, meeting them outside without bothering with my full environmental suit, just a breathing mask for the thin air. Lyra's companions regarded me with a mixture of wariness and curiosity, but there was no time for proper introductions. With urgent gestures and vocalizations, Lyra conveyed what I already knew: strangers had arrived, and they posed a threat. One of her companions, larger than the others with tawny striped fur, produced a rough map scratched onto a flat piece of crystal and indicated where the intruders had landed. Another, smaller with mottled gray fur, added marks showing the intruders' movement, directly toward one of the hidden entrances to the valley network. "How many?" I asked, holding up my fingers questioningly. Lyra held up 7 fingers, then pointed to shapes on the crystal map that I interpreted as vehicles or mechanized equipment. Definitely not scientific surveyors like myself. These were extraction specialists, the kind who move in fast, take what they want, and leave environmental devastation in their wake. I made a quick decision. "I'm going to help you," I said, pointing to myself, to them, then making a unified gesture. "We need to stop them before they find the valleys." The relief in Lyra's expression was unmistakable. She gripped my forearm briefly, her clawed hand gentle but conveying immense gratitude. Working together with a combination of gestures, drawings, and a limited understanding we'd built, we formulated a plan. I gathered equipment from the Nomad that might prove useful: signal jammers to disrupt their communications, a portable EMP device meant for emergencies that could disable their vehicles, various tools that could double as weapons if needed. Lyra's group led me along hidden paths toward the intruder's position, moving with a stealth and speed that had me struggling to keep pace despite their efforts to accommodate my limitations. As we traveled, I noted how they communicated among themselves, a combination of soft vocalizations, ear positions, tail movements, and subtle hand gestures that constituted a complex language I'd only begun to glimpse. We reached a vantage point overlooking the intruders' camp by midday. From our concealed position among a jumble of crystal formations, I could see they were indeed a private extraction team. Their equipment bore the logo of Axis Mining Collective, one of UMI's less scrupulous competitors. They had already deployed ground-penetrating radar arrays and were setting up a portable drilling rig. One of Lyra's companions, the tawny-striped male, growled low in his throat at the sight. Lyra placed a restraining hand on his arm, her own expression grim but controlled. She looked at me expectantly. I activated my signal jammer first, cutting off their ability to communicate with their ship or any orbital support. Then I targeted the EMP device, calibrating it to affect their equipment while minimizing damage to my own tech. The discharge was silent but effective. Their floodlights flickered and died. The drilling rig's motor seized, and their radar displays went dark. The confusion in the camp was immediate. The Axis team scrambled to diagnose the failures, several of them drawing sidearms and scanning the perimeter nervously. They hadn't spotted us, but they knew something was wrong. Lyra nodded approvingly at the effectiveness of my technology, then signaled to her companions. They melted away in different directions, circling the camp with predatory efficiency. I realized they intended to create distractions, drawing the intruders away from their equipment and separating them for easier handling. It worked perfectly. Strange sounds, somewhere between big cat roars and eerie whistles, echoed from multiple directions. The Axis team split up too, remaining to guard the equipment while the others investigated, weapons ready. I slipped closer to the camp during the confusion, planting additional devices on their critical equipment, trackers that would let me monitor them, and more permanent sabotage to ensure they couldn't easily repair what the EMP had damaged. I was placing the last device when one of the guards spotted me. "Hey, what the hell?" He raised his weapon, but before he could fire, a silver blur dropped from above. Lyra landed between us, a fearsome snarl revealing teeth designed for tearing flesh. The man staggered back in shock, firing wildly. The shots went wide, but the noise alerted his companions. What followed was chaos. Lyra's people harried the intruders from all sides, never engaging directly, but creating an atmosphere of terror with their screams, their brief, shocking appearances and disappearances, their obvious control of the terrain. I used the confusion to disable the team's transport, a simple matter of removing key components and power cells that would take them hours to track down, assuming they even had replacements. The Axis team leader, a hard-faced woman with augmented eyes, spotted me during this sabotage. Recognition flashed across her features. "A UMI surveyor? What's your stake in this?" she demanded, raising a nasty-looking pulse pistol. I had no chance to answer before Lyra burst from hiding, knocking the woman sideways with a powerful shoulder charge. The pulse pistol discharged, the energy bolt grazing my environmental suit and burning through to sear the flesh of my upper arm. The pain was instant and blinding, but through it, I saw the team leader recovering, bringing her weapon to bear on Lyra's unprotected back. Acting on pure instinct, I lunged forward and swung my heavy sampling tool like a club, connecting solidly with her forearm. The pistol went flying as bones audibly cracked. Her scream matched my own pain-filled cry. Lyra pulled me away as the woman clutched her broken arm, hatred burning in her augmented eyes. "You're dead," she spat. "Both of you. All of you. No one interferes with an Axis operation." We retreated, Lyra supporting much of my weight as the pain from the energy weapon made movement difficult. Worked through the night, my technical expertise combining with Lyra and her companion's knowledge of the terrain. They showed me on maps where I should place modified beacons that would broadcast the false readings. I programmed the devices with corrupted data that would indicate radioactive instability and structural weakness in the crystal formations, red flags for any mining operation. Morning brought no sign of the Axis team attempting to approach, but my ship's sensors detected increased communications from their landed vessel. They had overcome my jamming and were likely calling for support. We had perhaps a day, maybe two, before reinforcements arrived. Lyra's people moved with incredible efficiency, taking the beacons I'd prepared and dispersing to place them at strategic locations that would create a comprehensive false survey result. I focused on hacking into the planetary monitoring satellite that both UMI and Axis would rely on for initial surveys, uploading corrupt data that matched what our ground beacons would report. By sunset, the network was in place. Any corporation scanning this region of XC7 would receive consistent readings showing nothing but worthless, dangerous mineral deposits that would cost more to extract than they could possibly be worth. The real treasure, the living crystal network and its symbiotic relationship with Lyra's people, would remain hidden, protected by a shield of manufactured data. I still had one more decision to make, however. My contract with UMI. That night, as Lyra and I sat beside one of the ship's external heaters watching the strange auroras that occasionally painted XC7's night sky, I composed two messages in my mind. One would report that this world held nothing of value, that my survey had found only unstable, worthless minerals, essentially confirming the false data I'd planted. UMI would write off the expedition as a loss and move on to more promising worlds. The other message was my resignation. After 10 years as an independent surveyor, I was done. The work had grown increasingly hollow as I'd watched corporation after corporation strip worlds of their resources with little regard for any non-human life those worlds might harbor. XC7 was where I would draw my line. Lyra seemed to sense the weight of my thoughts. She made a soft trilling sound and touched my hand lightly, a questioning gesture. "I'm staying," I said simply, looking into those amber eyes. "If you'll have me." She tilted her head, perhaps not understanding my exact words, but clearly grasping my intent. After a moment, she nodded, a gesture she'd learned from me, but imbued with her own solemn gravity. I sent both messages the next morning, along with a warning about Axis Mining's illegal operation that would ensure UMI sent security forces to investigate, forces that would find only the false readings I'd engineered, and an Axis team that would be forced to retreat or face corporate espionage charges. Over the following days, Lyra introduced me properly to her people. There were perhaps 100 of them living in the Hidden Valley Network, the last survivors of a population that had once been much larger. Through a combination of drawings, gestures, and the rudimentary shared vocabulary we were building, I pieced together their history. They called themselves something like Valois, which I couldn't properly pronounce with my human vocal cords. Their ancestors had evolved on XC7 alongside the crystalline ecosystem, developing a symbiotic relationship with the formations I'd been sent to exploit. The crystals weren't merely part of their environment. They were essential to the Valois' biology, regulating aspects of their metabolism and possibly even facilitating their unique form of communication. Previous mining expeditions, centuries ago, had devastated large portions of XC7's crystal networks, driving the Valois to near extinction. Those that survived had retreated to these hidden valleys, becoming increasingly cautious of the strange visitors who occasionally came from the stars with their cutting and crushing machines. I spent weeks learning their ways, gradually being accepted into their community. My technological knowledge proved useful to them, providing early warning systems for approaching ships and methods to maintain their concealment. In return, they taught me how to survive in XC7's harsh environment, how to find the hidden passages between valleys, how to listen to the subtle songs of the crystal forests. Lyra remained my closest companion, my bridge between worlds. Her curiosity about my technology matched my fascination with her people's profound connection to their environment. We developed a language of our own, part gesture, part vocalization, part shared experience. Not truly fluent, but deep in its own way. The Nomad remained parked on a highland plateau, a connection to my past life and a guardian outpost that would warn of any approaching threat. Over time, I modified it to be less conspicuous, less obviously an operational vessel, more like an abandoned relic. Inside, however, it remained functional, my emergency exit if circumstances ever forced us to flee. That circumstance never came. The false data I'd planted held firm, and both UMI and Axis eventually classified XE7 as a dead prospect, not worth the investment of further exploration. Occasionally, automated survey probes would make orbital passes, but they only confirmed what their databases already contained. Nothing of value here. Move along. As seasons passed, the brutal ice crystal winters and the brief, vibrant crystal bloom summers, I found myself thinking less and less about Earth and the life I'd left behind. There had been no one waiting for me there anyway, no connection strong enough to draw me back to humanity's crowded worlds. Here, among the Valwire, I had found something I hadn't realized I was missing: purpose beyond profit, connection beyond contract. One evening, as we sat at the edge of a steaming pool in the heart of the main valley, watching juvenile Valwire splash and play in the mineral-rich waters, Lyra placed a crystal in my hand, one that pulsed with that now-familiar blue luminescence. Unlike the first one she had given me as a tentative offering so long ago, this one was set in an intricate framework of woven metal strands that could be worn as a pendant. She touched the crystal, then placed her hand over my heart, making a soft, melodic sound I'd never heard before. The crystal pulsed in time with the sound, then with my heartbeat. I understood this was no mere gift. It was a connection of belonging. I clasped the pendant around my neck, feeling a subtle warmth spread from it throughout my body. The crystal's glow brightened momentarily before settling into a rhythm that matched my pulse exactly. "Thank you," I said, the words woefully inadequate for what I felt. Lyra smiled, a gesture she'd adopted from me, but made her own with the slight curl of her upper lip that revealed just the tips of her canines. She leaned forward until our foreheads touched, her fur soft against my skin, her breath warm in the cool evening air. We remained that way for a long moment, no words needed between us. When she finally pulled back, her amber eyes reflected the light of XE7's moons and something deeper, a certainty of future. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes. The crystal pendant made it easier for me to find my way through the valley network without guidance, as if it somehow enhanced my perception of the hidden passages. The Valwire reacted differently to me as well, with less reservation, more inclusion. Children who had previously kept their distance now approached freely, curious about the strange, furless being who wore their sacred crystal. Seasons turned to years. My hair gained strands of silver that eventually matched Lyra's fur. The nomad, though maintained for emergencies, gathered dust and crystal sediment, becoming as much a part of the landscape as the natural formations around it. Its communications array still functioned, occasionally picking up distant transmissions that reminded me of the civilization I'd left behind. Corporate squabbles over mining rights on distant worlds, political upheavals on colonies I'd once visited, technological advances that would have fascinated me in my previous life. None of it drew me back. Here, I had found something genuine, something real in a way my former life of endless contracts and solitary surveys had never been. In my 7th year on XE7, a young Valwire born after my arrival reached maturity. During the ceremony marking this transition, she approached me with solemn purpose and spoke her first words to me in my own language. Words Lyra must have painstakingly taught her. "Thank you for saving our world," she said carefully, each word precisely formed despite the limitations of her vocal structure. I could only nod, emotion tightening my throat, as I watched the next generation of Valwire enter adulthood in a world that remained their own, unspoiled by the greed that had nearly destroyed it before. Later that night, as Lyra and I sat on a high overlook watching the crystal forest below shimmer in the moonlight, I found myself thinking about the irony of my situation. I had come to XE7 seeking valuable minerals, expecting nothing more than another routine survey, another paycheck. Instead, I discovered something no corporation could price, no contract could specify: a home, a purpose, a belonging. Lyra pressed against my side, her familiar warmth a comfort against the chill night air. She looked up at me with those remarkable amber eyes that had once simply stared at me from a distance, inscrutable and alien. Now I could read them as clearly as any human expression: contentment, trust, affection. "What was the most valuable discovery in your career as a surveyor?" she asked in our shared language of gestures, vocalizations, and deep understanding. I smiled, knowing my answer immediately. "This," I said simply, encompassing with a sweep of my hand the valley below, the crystal pendant at my throat, and most importantly, her presence beside me. She nodded, a soft purr rumbling in her chest. We sat in comfortable silence as the crystal formations pulsed with their inner light, a living heartbeat that had become synchronized with my own. My initial survey mission had long since been forgotten by the corporations that commissioned it. But the real discovery, the one that had changed everything, had begun the moment I first looked up to see a Beastwoman standing outside my ship, silently watching me with those intent amber eyes. Sometimes, the most profound discoveries are not the ones we are sent to find, but the ones that find us when we least expect them.